Thank you very much, John. Obviously, John gave us a fantastic overview of Reagan, Thatcher, and the Pope. Right now, we are going to get more specific. And next we have Robin Harris, a member of the Prime Minister's policy unit from 1989 to 1990, been active in conservative politics in England for much longer than that, from 1978 onwards. I was surprised to learn, I know Robin's work via British media. We were speaking earlier about his recent criticisms of David Cameron in magazines like Prospect, Standpoint, and various Fleet Street newspapers. I was surprised to learn, though, that according to his biography on the Heritage Foundation website, that he's also written studies of late medieval France, of the city-state of Dubrovnik, and of the French diplomat statesman Charles Maurice de Talleyrand. So apparently he is much deeper than his knowledge of Lady Thatcher. Also should be pointed out that Robin had a helping hand in producing Mrs. Thatcher's two biographies, the second of which, The Downing Street Years, is really phenomenal. Unlike most books that are produced by people who come out of office, that are these self-serving, really sort of boring books, Downing Street Years is a tremendous achievement, and John O'Sullivan was also involved in that too. So, without further ado, Robin Harris is going to speak to us about Prime Minister Thatcher, Iron Lady.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. John O'Sullivan has cantered over quite a lot of territory, so we will just have to adjust the territory that we stand on a little bit in the light of that, but I don't think it'll be too difficult. Well, the Swedes, as you know a lot about iron. And I recall at school learning how the rise of Sweden as a great power in the 17th century under Gustavus Adolphus was based on it. And even though I don't think that Gustavus Adolphus was known formally as an Iron King, he might have been, because he and his armies certainly made good use of iron. More generally, of course, iron is associated with unbending characters and harsh policies. Germany had its famous Iron Chancellor Bismarck, who amply qualifies in both respects. And we British have thrown up two notable examples of ferrous leadership. The one not the subject of this paper is Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Wellington. Now, Wellington was our greatest general, but he did not receive this sobriquet because of his mighty feats of arms. No, he was called the Iron Duke because the iron shutters he put over his windows at Apsley House to protect against stones from the London mob drew that sobriquet upon him. For like many British heroes, Wellington was often highly unpopular. This is also true of the person who is our subject today. And her title is also paradoxical, doubly so in fact. Margaret Thatcher is widely and rightly acknowledged to be Britain's greatest peacetime Prime Minister. And she's also, while we're about it, someone who fought and won a war. And she is endowed with an array of formidable and intimidating qualities. But she's also, that said, an extremely feminine woman, charming, warm-hearted, and generous. The iron is real, but it is a casing, and it does not contain a vacuum. The second element of paradox stems from how Mrs. Thatcher gained her accolade. As so often in English history, it was originally an insult. In 1975 and 1976, as leader of the Tory opposition, she delivered two major foreign policy speeches. These were not the usual bland tour d'horizon which would-be statesmen deliver to establish their credentials. Rather, they constituted a radical and explosive critique of the then fashionable consensus in favor of a Western foreign policy based upon détente. The first speech, drafted mainly by the historian Robert Conquest, who was hated by the left for being right about Stalin's terror, concentrated on the Helsinki process. It echoed Solzhenitsyn's warning about according legitimacy to the Soviet system in exchange for unverifiable undertakings about human rights. It thus implicitly challenged the so-called Brezhnev doctrine, which can be summarized as once in the socialist camp, always in the socialist camp. The second speech, drafted by Robert Moss, foreign editor of The Economist, who was hated by the left for being right about the Chilean Revolution, concentrated on the resurgent Soviet military threat, particularly their nuclear arsenal and their expanding navy. Now, these two speeches formed a coherent whole. The first annoyed most of the British press, but the second annoyed beyond measure the plodding Soviet propaganda machine, almost as much as it did the plodding shadow Foreign Secretary Reggie Maudling. Anyway, in what passed as wit among apparatchik comics at the time, the Soviet military newspaper Red Star scornfully mocked Mrs. Thatcher as the Iron Lady. The jibe was reported on the Press Association ticker tapes and spotted by Mrs. Thatcher's media advisor, Gordon Rees. She duly used the phrase about herself that evening in a broadcast speech, and the job was done. As she observed in her memoirs, the Soviets never did me a greater favor. Soviet tactics were often stupid, but their deeper perceptions were often correct. They had worked out that Margaret Thatcher was indeed different from most of the rest of the British political class, who thought that the threat from Moscow was overrated, and that if it wasn't, you couldn't do much about it anyway, and that all in all it was a bit crude, even a bit paranoid to go on about it. Well, Britain hasn't produced as many great Cold War warriors as the United States. In fact, only three names come to mind: Winston Churchill, Ernie Bevin, and of course Margaret Thatcher. And there's a reason for this. America has never, in modern times, been just another Western power. It was and is a superpower, and the leader of what in the Cold War years was a clearly defined free world. America's interests as a nation were therefore indistinguishable from the system which it embodied. For Britain, by contrast, life was more complicated. Initially preoccupied with decolonization, then with the distractions of Europe, and all the time worried about its economic weakness, Cold War Britain had much more than the Cold War to fret about. In fact, the Cold War only loomed large to the very small minority who saw an organic connection between the country's problems at home and its failures abroad, and put both down to something called socialism. Now, viewed from that perspective, Britain by the 1970s looked in many ways ripe for a takeover. Not military, perhaps, but cultural, social, and ideological. By this stage, Britain itself was a broadly socialist country, and so movement towards communism was, by one reckoning at any rate, essentially a matter of degree. In Scandinavia, you'll have experienced similar perceptions. The notion of convergence between the capitalist and communist systems was fashionable at the time, and no wonder, because Western leaders were doing all they could to support it by collectivizing our societies and economies. The Soviets, it should be noted by contrast, showed remarkably little enthusiasm about moving towards us, at least while détente continued. At the same time, and the truth about this is still dribbling out day by day, mainly because dead men can't sue, numbers of respectable, well-placed agents of influence were confidently and profitably working to undermine our system's willingness to defend itself. And there's nothing like thinking you're on the winning side with a bit of pocket money to boot to encourage collaboration. So yes, the Soviets were right about Margaret Thatcher. She was unusually radical in her outlook because she was among the few people equally committed to undoing socialism at home and abroad. She simply had no time for it. She'd seen through it at an early age, and it held no charm for her. This was, at that time, going quite against the national grain. The Labour Party, the trade unions, and left-wing intellectuals had worked hard during and after the war to create a false but beguiling myth. It was, in theory, about equality and fair shares for all, and in practice, about a bloated public sector to be carried by the rest. It had gone a long, long way. Some of the effects were frankly absurd. For a certain kind of socialist, like the leader of the Labour Party, Michael Foot, for example, the Second World War was indeed Britain's finest hour, but not because of military heroics, but because of the greatly exaggerated national wartime solidarity. The war had, by this interpretation, been won by collective mobilization and government planning, and so would be the peace. There was a self-righteous, high-minded tone about much of this propaganda, with a lot of hatred of the United States and of indulgence of the Soviet Union thrown in. This phony patriotism, which finds an echo in the current outburst of artificial enthusiasm for Britain's decrepit National Health Service, cut no ice with Mrs. Thatcher. She recognised the left's flag-waving for what it was, a variety of disguised self-hatred. As Canning famously puts it in his verse, a steady patriot of the world alone, the friend of every country but his own. Margaret Thatcher, above all, did not believe that there was anything remotely admirable about a planned economy or society. She thought, like Hayek, that it was precisely to avoid the suppression of individual liberty by the state that Britain had fought a war, and that it should not swallow the same system under other colours in peacetime. She was robust, partly because that was her temperament, but also because she was not plagued by the doubts induced by shame. She inherited none of the political guilt that many conservatives felt about appeasement, which they or their families had supported, but which her family had always opposed. Nor did she suffer the Tory social guilt either, because everything her family had, and it wasn't that much after all, they'd worked for and scrimped for and saved for. She didn't believe what so many socialists continue to believe, namely that people need to be looked after by government. She'd seen in her hometown of Grantham that people living by Christian principles in stable communities could look after themselves and each other without upending the traditional order of things and without accepting ownership by the state. Above all, she believed that given the chance and incentive, most people, not all, but the great majority, could succeed. Margaret Thatcher remained true to her roots. In her first speech as Conservative Party leader, she set out what she believed. It was what she'd learnt in Grantham, and I quote. She said, "Let me give you my vision. A man's right to work as he will, to spend what he earns, to own property, to have the state as servant and not as master, these are the British inheritance." It was what she wanted for Britain. But by extension, because it was based on universal truths about human nature that were absolute and not relative, it was what she also wanted for those denied these things behind the Iron Curtain. Now, allowing for different temperaments and different national backgrounds, much of this echoes the values embraced by Ronald Reagan. President Reagan and Prime Minister Thatcher knew what they believed and were known by friends and enemies to believe it because they developed and defended those beliefs when they were deeply unfashionable. Both were also fortunate because events proved them right and just in time. He was being written off as too old and she as too risky, when their chances came. In both cases, it was their opponents' policy failures in domestic matters that were electorally decisive. But equally significant in the long run was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. This finally proved the critics of détente were right. Now, such things don't always happen. When Charles James Fox was shown a passage in one of Edmund Burke's writings predicting disaster, a prediction which Fox himself had attacked, but which had then been proved correct, Fox replied, "Well, Burke is right. But Burke is often right, only he is right too soon." Mrs. Thatcher and Ronald Reagan were right, but not too soon. Both were conservative radicals, but once in power, she had to be even more radical and confrontational than her great friend and ally. And we must remember why, as John O'Sullivan has touched on, because it does bear on their similar but also their distinctive attitudes towards Cold War security and diplomacy. America, at least until recently, has not known socialism. Ronald Reagan cut the American economy free of high taxes and over-regulation that Carter had introduced, and after a short recession, when inflation was squeezed out by the Fed, the American economy forged ahead. Now, this didn't just work through into higher living standards at home. It threw America's rivals, above all, it threw Moscow into despair and confusion. It was now clear who was going to be buried and by whom. Yet this was, in truth, a shift back to the American way, not an about turn prior to a new direction. Mrs. Thatcher, of course, used similar rhetoric, but it was much more likely to fall on deaf ears. She too also believed that her policies of cutting back state control and empowering individuals, families, and businesses would liberate the national spirit. Yet that spirit had been suppressed by a peculiarly vicious British brand of socialism for at least 3 decades. And it took years of conflict with the unions, the nationalised industries, the bureaucracy, most of several Tory cabinets, and the Argentine armed forces to prevail. Again, it's important to remind those who didn't experience these events just how closely they were connected with the wider international struggle against communism. And I give just 2 instances. First, the conflict between Britain and Argentina. Well, it looks to many now, and it looked to many of Britain's friends and allies even at the time, as something of a distraction. To which one might reply that even if true, it was a distraction that was hatched by the Argentine junta and not by the British cabinet. The Reagan administration, though finally coming down on Britain's side, feared that the overthrow of Galtieri's regime would weaken the fight against communism in South America. But the effect of Britain's victory upon perceptions in Moscow was much more significant. Sometime later, a Soviet general frankly admitted to Mrs. Thatcher that they had assumed that Britain wouldn't try to take back the islands, and that if we did, we would fail. What the Soviets then, like the Russians now, took notice of was sacrifice and success, and their respect for Britain increased because we had endured the one and achieved the other. The second instance is a domestic one, and John has touched on this, but I'm going to mention it from a slightly different angle. And that was the year-long violent coal miners' strike in 1984-5. Now, this was a political strike. It was organized by a hard core of Marxist militants, and it was designed without serious attempts to disguise the fact to bring down the elected Conservative government of the day. Significantly, it also turned out in its closing stages to have been financed by both Libya and the Soviet Union, about which Gorbachev subsequently lied. When the Thatcher government defeated that strike, it was as much a blow for the freedom of the West as when some new missile was deployed or some act of espionage blocked. It was another way, and an indispensable way, in which the Cold War was won. So there were big differences in the manner that Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan had to set about their tasks. She must, as her first duty, roll back socialism at home while defending British national interests abroad, and playing a supporting role, of course, in the global struggle against communism. He had a simpler, though not necessarily easier, goal, and this was to mobilize the re-energized resources of America against the Soviet system, to force it to transform, and finally to dissolve, all without a possibly catastrophic military conflict. The two leaders' different priorities were often evident during these years. They disagreed about how to react to the Polish crisis in 1981, about the Falklands War in 1982, about the invasion of Grenada in 1983, even initially about the response to Libya and the raid in 1986, though she firmly supported the president when she realized how much depended on it. Now, these disagreements reflect the fact that no matter how much national leaders like and respect one another, and even how much they agree on the fundamentals, the interests of nation states will differ. Superpowers sometimes forget this, but lesser powers cannot. There was another reason which is frequently overlooked. NATO then, even more than now, had to be carried along. It was of great importance to keep the West Europeans on board the vessel which, in effect, President Reagan was commanding. Mrs. Thatcher realized this. Yes, she had fierce conflicts with Europe on budgetary matters. She engaged in what I think was a misjudged, though understandable, dispute with West Germany over reunification, though it should be said, in answer to some of the material that's come out recently, she was absolutely right on the most important matter, and crucially so, that the reunited Germany should be within NATO and thus firmly adhering to the West, something which Gorbachev and the fellow travelers did not at all want to see. And by the end of her time, she was again locked in a contest over the future direction of the Soviet Union, where, like Edmund Burke, she was right too soon. But Mrs. Thatcher was also highly sensitive to the Cold War battle for hearts and minds in Europe. Washington so often goes from one extreme to the other. Either an administration is willing to make enormous concessions to Europe without due thought, or it is to be found trampling on oh-so-sensitive European toes without reflection. The British are different. We do not, by and large, like Europe very much, though we may and do disagree among ourselves on what to do about the fact. But we generally understand our European neighbors very well. Ensuring that the Reagan administration understood what the Europeans thought and felt, even if their wishes and feelings were in the end often sidelined, was in the 80s, and it will always be, an important element in the US-UK relationship. It's also in the Cold War context, and not just a domestic one, that Mrs. Thatcher's famous Bruges speech of 1988 ought to be considered. Her reason for making it was, of course, in large part to mobilize British sentiment against the growing bureaucratic and political intrusions from Brussels. But it was also an expression of her view, and a deep-seated view at that, at what must be seen as a tipping point in the Cold War, about the nature of political freedom itself. And this, she said, clearly must involve national sovereignty and national self-expression. And on this matter, there could be no double standards applying in Europe. You may recall that even after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Jacques Delors was urging Europe to guarantee the outer perimeter of the Soviet Union. Against this view, Mrs. Thatcher stated at Bruges in 1988, I quote, "We must never forget that east of the Iron Curtain, peoples who once enjoyed a full share of European culture, freedom and identity have been cut off from their roots. We shall always look on Warsaw, Prague and Budapest as great European cities." Now, on the three most important aspects of dealing with the Soviet Union and bringing down the evil empire, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan were, in any case, at one. The first was the defense build-up. This was mainly a United States matter. but the acquisition of Trident II was a significant British contribution to the West's nuclear arsenal, and President Reagan and Caspar Weinberger ensured that it was trouble-free. No less important from the point of Western solidarity, as John has pointed out, was the deployment of cruise and Pershing missiles. In fact, the only significant difference of view between the two leaders was over SDI. Now, here the British were sceptical, but Mrs. Thatcher personally grasped that the project was both viable and necessary. Indeed, she'd been studying the technical possibilities back in the 1970s. She did not share the president's vision of a nuclear weapons-free world. She saw SDI as strengthening, not superseding, the nuclear deterrent. I suggest it's a great pity that ballistic missile defense, which is SDI's offspring, is not similarly understood in Washington now. The second element the leaders had in common was their practice of Cold War diplomacy. Both, it is often forgotten, were highly effective negotiators. And this was essentially because people believed what they said and feared what they might do. Yet each was capable of using personal rapport to win over opponents. The most famous of these was, of course, Mikhail Gorbachev. And the story of how it happened has been often enough told and sometimes exaggerated, not to need repetition. But I want to read out to you an important observation from the Thatcher memoirs, which I think puts it in a better context. She writes here, "I always believed that our Western system would ultimately triumph if we did not throw our advantages away, because it rested on the unique, almost limitless creativity and vitality of individuals. Even a system like that of the Soviets, which set out to crush the individual, could never totally succeed in doing so, as was shown by the Solzhenitsyns, Sakharovs, Bukovskis, and Ratushinskayas, and thousands of other dissidents and refuseniks. This also implied that at some time the right individual could challenge even the system which he had used to attain power. For this reason, unlike many who otherwise shared my approach to the Soviet Union, I was convinced that we must seek out and then cultivate and sustain such a person, while recognizing the clear limits of our power to do so. And that is why those who subsequently considered that I was led astray from my original approach to the Soviet Union because I was dazzled by Mr. Gorbachev were wrong. I spotted him because I was searching for someone like him." The third element of the common Reagan-Thatcher approach, and one where the role of Pope John Paul the Great is of still larger significance, consists in the struggle of ideas. In London in 1982, President Reagan proclaimed the Reagan Doctrine. From now on, it was a declared element of American policy that democracy must not stop at the Soviet Empire's frontier. Both leaders turned this into reality by their actions. When Mrs. Thatcher went to Poland in 1980 and was mobbed by cheering Solidarity strikers at the Gdansk shipyard, that was a moment that shook communism in its redoubts, as well as discrediting it in Western Marxism circles. It shattered the great lie that communism liberates workers while capitalism enslaves them. And it showed that trade unionists in Poland knew this, even if their counterparts in London did not. Similarly, the fact that she and President Reagan persistently intervened on behalf of dissidents was proof to the Soviets that there was indeed no price that the West would not pay to see human dignity honored. Because of their Christian conviction of the worth of every human being, both leaders instinctively adopted the cause of those who suffered under communism as their own, and did so in a profoundly personal way. So, a final reflection. What do such titans as Margaret Thatcher have to teach us today? There are, of course, many practical lessons, not least in free enterprise economics, that should be relearnt before it's too late. We also need to rediscover and apply her conservative conviction that there will always be evil, always dangers, and so always a need for strength and vigilance. A sugary utopianism now dominates on both sides of the Atlantic, and it's time for a return to more substantial fare. But in the end, the most important lesson that Mrs. Thatcher teaches is that great leaders make a difference. She possessed, to a unique degree, the moral insight, the intelligence, and the valor to know and do what was right. And many millions in many countries have cause to rejoice at the fact. Thank you.